Recently, a lot of non-Black Latinxs have become politically activated. I believe it has to do in large part to the current wave of Black liberatory action. And it's a good thing that we non-Black Latinxs have become politically activated. I think that it's way overdue for us to have some sort of, political identity of sorts. But the problem here is that with every new wave of folks who become politically active comes a repetition of historical mistakes. So today I'm gonna address a big one. The recent uptake of the term La Raza. In this video, I want to unpack why the term La Raza is hurtful to a lot of people and why a lot of contemporary Latinx organizers and organizations and activist groups no longer use the term La Raza as a form of unifying call, right? And so this video is mostly to address fellow non-Black Latinxs, but of course everybody has a bit to learn. One thing I do want to say is that if you're a white viewer who's not Latinx and you're like, oh wow, those people are so messed up, right? There's so much racism in their midst. This isn't your opportunity to do all that, right? If anything, this is a call out to your own whiteness, right? And how it has impacted and tainted a lot of other cultures across the world due to imperialism and colonialism, right? So if you're here to learn, that's cool. What I want you to take as like a non-Latinx person more is to really engage with the history of white violence that has permeated throughout the world and that is baked into all of our systems. So yeah, buckle up and let's talk about this very divisive issue. Hi, my name is Ruben, and today we're here to talk about the term La Raza. And this is going to become part of a series of videos that I'm going to make entitled White Supremacy and Latinidad. This is part 1, Raza Cósmica. So, this is going to be a serious topic. If you're really attached to the term La Raza, I want you to make it through the whole video. Right? I don't want you to just like automatically shut it off, even though I know that's what a lot of old school folks particularly are gonna do. But I want you to like kind of engage the material that I'm putting out there before kind of coming up with your own rebuttals, which I'm probably gonna acknowledge in this conversation. And either way, you're gonna leave me hate in the comments, so let's just get it over with. All right, let's go. So the history, right? When people say Viva la Raza or refer to, their people as Raza, what they're saying literally is the race, right? Or long live the race, right? And this isn't just something that folks came out of the blue, right? This is a term that has a long historical, at this point, almost 100 years of life, right? And specifically the term La Raza comes from a Mexican philosopher, quote unquote, Jose Vasconcelos, who in, post-revolutionary Mexico took it upon himself, and actually the state co-signed him, was developing the national identity of Mexico. And it wasn't just him, it was like other folks in the artistic field, such as Diego Rivera, right, who were tasked with building a national Mexican identity. Right. And so after the Mexican Revolution, there was a lot of folks, particularly indigenous folks, who weren't down with the nation state because it was a colonizing force. Right. So in order to kind of bring them into the fold of the Mexican national identity, Jose Vasconcelos came up with this term, La Raza Cósmica, right, to, in his own words, essentially modernize, right, the indigenous person, to bring them into the modern age, right? And so what he meant by La Raza Cósmica, which literally translates into the cosmic race, was that Mexico in particular had all the makings of creating the perfect human being, a cosmic human being, right? according to him, it was a good thing that colonialism and imperialism and all of that violence happened, because it allowed for black people to be enslaved and be brought into Latin America, for Asian people to come to Latin America as well through trade and also through slavery, right? Because a lot of something that people forget is that there was Asian, particularly with a lot of Chinese folks who were enslaved also in Latin America. So he thought that because we had, you know, Asian folks, black folks who were enslaved from Africa, and indigenous folks who were colonized and raped, and because the white person, the white European, also had to do with this, right? He's the one who set off the whole colonialism and imperialism thing. That it was a good thing that all these races got to mix, right? Because they created a new human, the mestizo, right? For those who don't know what mestizo means, mestizo essentially translates into mixed race person from Latin America, most likely with an indigenous and white background, right? That's usually what folks understand mestizo to be, someone who is mixed race from Latin America with indigenous and white backgrounds. But what a lot of folks fail to acknowledge is that a lot of what we know as mestizaje originally was imagined as a mixture of African, Asian, indigenous, and white. So Jose Vasconcelos came up with this term, on one hand, to kind of flatten the discussions about race that were happening at the time in Latin America, and to sort of pacify a lot of folks, particularly indigenous folks and black folks in Latin America, and specifically Mexico, and essentially be like, oh, there shouldn't be any fighting, like, you know, we're all one, we're all Mexican, right? And on the other hand, to build this mythology of Mexicans as superior, right? If Mexicans or mixed race people from Latin America are the cosmic race, right, then they are superior, right? And obviously this has, when we break it down like that, it has alarming connotations, because it is a different side of the coin of white supremacy. Some folks refer to this as Mestizo Supremacy, which is this belief that the mixed race people from Latin America, the mestizo, is a superior race. Specifically, the lighter skin that they are, or the whiter they are. Because don't believe for a second that Jose Vasconcelos was like, yeah, brown mestizos and like black mestizos are like the way to go. Like, no, a lot of his writings had to do with like essentially, in his words, more or less, erasing black people altogether and quote unquote taming indigenous people, right? So they had a very racist foundation. Additionally, it had an Orientalist foundation because it saw Chinese immigrants as a threat to the national formation. So it also looked to stop booming populations of Asian people in Latin America, specifically Mexico. Some folks might say that because of his creation of this theory of la raza cósmica, which is a whole like long essay that he put out, that this theory and this mindset of la raza cósmica gave birth to indigenismo, right, which a lot of people defend as a good thing, because indigenismo is like this idea that we are all indigenous, right? Everybody in Latin America is indigenous, right? But what that does, and what a lot of native folks, indigenous folks specifically to Latin America, take a problem with, is that flattens everybody, right? That if everybody in Latin America is indigenous, then the state can go on perpetuating its colonial violence, right? Which has never stopped, by the way. Indigenous people are still targeted in Latin America, as we see in Oaxaca specifically, and as we see throughout Central America. And of course, there's Brazil, right? Where a lot of the fires that have happened in Brazil are due to the fact that the state wants to continue its genocide against indigenous people. So when folks subscribe to indigenismo, what they do is that they flatten the indigenous identity so that the state doesn't have to pay attention and take care of indigenous needs, right? So that's one of the big criticisms of indigenismo. And so another thing is that indigenismo allows for a lot of people to appropriate indigenous cultures, right, and decontextualize a lot of indigenous practices, which is a big problem in the Chicanx Mexican community, right, and in other Latinx communities. But I'm being very specific for a reason, because it is primarily Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanxes, who continue to use Viva la Raza and who continue to subscribe to indigenismo. And so the state really latched on to Jose Vasconcelos's ideas of la raza cósmica, or racial mixture, because they essentially promised that they would improve indigenous people by folding them into the national identity, right, and getting rid of their Indianness, as the text states, right? It's translated from Spanish to English. And so it, in a way, Jose Vasconcelos' work saw whiteness as the future, right? And the elimination of the other, right? Of blackness, of Asianness, of indigeneity. And altogether, his work really ignored that the reason that why there was racial mixture, right? The reason why there was a lot of mix of white and indigenous people in Latin America was because of rape, right? Imperialism and colonialism used rape as a violent tool of domination, right? And of labor exploitation as well, right? And of conquering and of oppression. As a matter of fact, in his long essay, La Raza Cósmica, Vasconcelos himself says that essentially Latin America owes white Europeans a lot, and so it would not disavow them, right? Like, that's directly from the text. And his text also goes on to say essentially that blending into this like mestizo, right, this Latin American mixed race person would also eliminate blackness, right, which he thought was really ugly, right? And again, we're seeing a lot of the same anti-blackness that is, still continues today, right? And we'll get to that part a little bit later in this video. And actually, in the Raza Cósmica, he actually goes on to say even more white supremacist stuff, right? He essentially says that according to his research or his philosophy, he believed that white features would continue to permeate, right, the average human, right? Because to him, he thought that we would reproduce according to what we thought was, pleasurable or would, bring us to the future. And according to him, that looked like whiteness, right? So to him, he wanted to eliminate a lot of the other, people of color, all the marginalized races by blending them with whiteness in order to eliminate what he thought was ugly. According to scholar Lynette Manrique, Jose Vasconcelos believed that essentially, mestizaje would get rid of what he considered was, the undesirable, uglier racial stock and promote whiteness, which he considered to be a more beautiful racial stock, right? He believed that every race was essentially improved by mixing with whiteness. And that was what he imagined when he wrote La Raza Cósmica. And that is essentially what permeated through the national identity, right? La Raza then becomes this idea of a mixed race person who strives to whiteness, right? Or who mix with whiteness, right? And it wasn't just his book La Raza Cósmica. There's also other works that he used to kind of drive his racist, eugenics-based La Raza Cósmica point forward. One of the most well-known is The Race Problem in Latin America, which was a lecture that was part of a series of lectures which essentially tried to paint the future of the racial makeup of Latin America, right? So like he's literally calling for eugenics, right? That's literally what he's doing. He's literally saying that if we regulate how people reproduce, then we can make sure that Black people, indigenous folks, and Asian folks are not reproducing at the same rate as white folks, right? This is And folks have to know that this is somebody who had an impact on how the Mexican identity came to be, right? So this is not just some bigot who, wrote this stuff and, that was it. No, I am addressing his work because it is so foundational to a lot of Mexican political identity, right? And it's a little startling that folks don't know this history, right? Because they never question how they were raised, right? How they were raised to think about race, or the terms that they were encouraged to yell as a sign of unity, right? So that's why we're going over this. We're also going over his work because, like I said, his work had a real impact on the Mexican identity. As a matter of fact, in 1930, due to his work, because his La Raza Cósmica philosophy really took off in Mexico, Mexico actually dropped racial categories from the census in 1930. And as a matter of fact, Black people were not counted in the census until about 2015 in Mexico. That is 85 years where they did not count for their Black population. Mexico did not care to provide for their Black population, and they still really don't, right? There's still a largely ignored population along with indigenous people in Mexico and throughout Latin America, if we're going to be honest. Now, when we talk about Viva la Raza and the use of the term La Raza, a lot of folks bring up the Chicano Movement, and they say, well, the Chicano Movement kind of did away with the bad history of the term La Raza. They use it as a term of empowerment, right? But one thing that they fail to consider is that the Chicano movement itself was very plagued by nationalism and anti-indigeneity, right? Which are essential to the Mexican national identity, right? I would wager to say that they're essential to every national identity, particularly in the Americas. And so considering this, it's easy to see how Chicanos saw this rallying cry of Viva la Raza as empowering to them without critically thinking about what it meant, right? Without critically thinking about why it was wrong to conflate, people and a national identity with a race. And that has everything to do with how the Mexican state indoctrinates its people, right? If all you learn is that race doesn't exist here, and we're all one race, and you're not Black, you're not indigenous, you're Mexican. If that's what you learn in the states, the schools, right, then that is what you're going to believe your entire life. And especially if you never hear otherwise. So when we look at the Chicano movement in the 70s, we're talking about only a 50-year or so gap between when the term was popularized and when the Chicanos in the US began to use it as a term for empowerment, right? That, quite frankly, was not enough for counter ideas to permeate the popular media, right? Especially when, again, the state is doing everything in its power to make sure people believe that La Raza and La Raza Cósmica and Viva la Raza are terms that we should adopt to talk about all of Latinx folks or all of Mexicans, right? It continues to be in the state's best interest to continue to push this notion so that it can continue its violence against indigenous people and against Black people in its state. However, a look at more contemporary Latinx and Chicanx, or Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicana, Latine, Chicane, a look at more of these contemporary movements reveals that a lot of folks have moved away from that term and away from unifying under Viva la Raza. And some folks might say, well, language changes, right? And I completely agree. Language does change. It's why a lot of us tend to use more inclusive language, such as Latine, Latinx, and so forth, right? But the thing with the term La Raza and Viva la Raza is that if you really look at the contemporary use of the term, it hasn't changed very much. This is the most evident when we hear the popular saying, mejorar la raza, which literally translates into improve the race. And this is usually used when talking about dating and having children, right? A lot of folks will say, you should date somebody who's lighter skinned than you or white in order to improve the race, right? And that usually means that to essentially breed the brown and the black and the indigenous out of you, right, or out of the family line. And so this lines up perfectly with Jose Vasconcelos's teachings of La Raza Cósmica, which essentially again promoted that whiteness be prioritized in order to get rid of all the other races. And some folks who might be from other Latinx countries might be listening to this and be like, oh my God, we have the same saying, or we have a similar saying, right? I think about specifically like Brazilian folks have this historical initiative, right? And this historical violence of blancamiento, right? Which would literally translates into whitening, right? They had this forced or like promoted whitening of their population, right? So this is not all too different from that. Actually, it's the exact same thing. And so I need folks to ask themselves, like, why do you think we're still using this term? Why do you think we're still using the race to refer to nationality? Like, who wins when we conflate race and nationality, right? Who is erased when we do that? And the answer is, like I've mentioned before, is that indigenous folks, black folks, are the ones who end up being erased. It allows for us to ignore the violence that indigenous people are facing. It allows for us to ignore the violence that black people are facing in Latin America, in Mexico, to be specific to this term. And it's that violence on a state level, but it's also that violence on a personal level, right? On a societal level. I'm sure a lot of you who are from Latin American backgrounds have probably heard the term or like the saying, like, oh, race doesn't exist back in our home country, right? Race doesn't exist racism doesn't exist in Mexico or in Central America or in Brazil, or racism doesn't exist in X Latinx country, right? Latin American country. And that is how ingrained in us it is. It's basically like, if we're all the same race, then nobody experienced racism, right? Which is a fallacy in and of its own, because not very many states are homogeneous, right? They're all heterogeneous, right? Which means that there's a wide variety of different folks of different diverse backgrounds, right? And so note how even our language promotes this idea of colorblindness, right? So it's a lot of things that La Raza Cósmica is responsible for, right? Like colorblindness, like systemic racism, genocide, anti-blackness, and all of that is carried when we say things like La Raza or Viva la Raza. And so one weird retort that I've heard to our calls to end the use of the term La Raza is that, what if we can reclaim it? And I ask yourself, like, why would you want to reclaim a saying that is essentially long live the race? Ask yourself, who uses that? When we translate it to English, who says things like long live the race, right? And immediately your mind should go to white supremacists, because that's essentially who uses that term, right? We have white supremacists who have their 14 words, which essentially translates into long live the race, but with way more words, right? So that's, point one. And plus another point is that the term La Raza can be really triggering for folks who are not of Mexican descent, right? As Claudia Milian, who is a director of the Latina studies in the Global South at Duke University, states, the term is not all-encompassing for U.S. Latinos, U.S. Latinxes. It's actually very Mexican-centric. For example, the Latino population in North Carolina contains many Central American folks, most of them who are of indigenous backgrounds. So for them, Milian states essentially that they're very suspicious of these racial categories, these racial theories, right? They go on to say, I don't know if La Raza would work for some indigenous migrants here. After all, to them, it was La Raza who were trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. And so Milian is not only talking about like the historical genocide, but of the contemporary genocide that not only the nation states of Latin America are perpetuating, but specifically when it comes to Central Americans, the genocide that Mexico is perpetuating against them. And I've talked about this before in my video about the Central American refugee crisis, but to reiterate, a lot of Mexican folks, particularly mestizos and white folks, are being really racist and anti-indigenous towards the Central American refugees, right? And so for them, a lot of the times when they hear things like Viva la Raza or La Raza this and that, what they're hearing is, they're triggered because what they're hearing is the same type of language that was used to oppress them as they were trying to make their way to the US. And some folks have argued that Viva la Raza is something akin to Black Power. But what that ignores is that mestizos are the majority in Latin America, right? They are not the oppressed class there. So when folks use the empowering term Black Power, they're talking about giving power to Black people who are globally oppressed because of global anti-Blackness, right? Whereas mestizaje, right, being of mixed race is the norm in Latin America. That doesn't mean it's without its, its white supremacists and white-centered media, right, and state, but also, right, we still hold privilege, right? So it's not comparable. And it can be argued that a lot of states in Latin America are actually Mestizo Supremacist states, right? But that's a conversation for another time. But I do want you to keep that in mind. Like, what does it mean when mestizos are the majority in Latin America? What kind of ideology does that breed, right? Because we'll find, as a lot of y'all have seen, that Latinx white supremacists in the US are not a rarity at all. Listen, if you use the term and didn't know its sinister meaning, like, it's okay, like, forgive yourself, move on, do better, educate others, educate yourself further on this topic. I've included a bunch of resources in the link in the description. A lot of the fault of folks using Viva la Raza or La Raza, is the fault of the state for miseducating folks and perpetuating white supremacist myths of racial mixture and eugenics. What I want folks, particularly folks who are Latinx, who are only recently politically activated, is to be critical of history, right? Be critical of the things we were taught, right? Like I mentioned, a lot of folks probably picked up this term looking at the Chicano Movement and seeing how that was really dope for a lot of Chicanos, right? To feel really empowered. But as I've mentioned before, like in other videos and other podcasts, right? What good is empowerment if it comes to the detriment of other people, right? If it oppresses other people. So that's one of the big faults of the Chicano movement, right? That folks don't talk about often, is how it often perpetuated racist and nationalist ideas, that we are trying to separate ourselves now, that we know better. So I would suggest you do the same. And if you still are not convinced, I want you to ask yourself, like, what good comes out of referring to yourself and your people as the master race, right? As the cosmic race, right? Like this term, like reclaiming the term La Raza, like if you want to go that route, like it doesn't make sense, because the term La Raza was never meant to disempower mestizos. It was always meant to empower them. So reclaiming it is rather counterproductive. All in all, if this video didn't convince you not to use Viva la Raza or La Raza to refer to Latinx folks as a whole, I don't really know what to tell you. I've presented historical facts, I've presented contemporary analysis, and even Chicano history. So whatever, continue using it. That's all you, homie. But I don't want you to act brand new when you're called out or where you're not welcomed in certain spaces, because you continue to use this very harmful term, right? A lot of folks, a lot of orgs, a lot of movements in Latinx spheres that are really, doing really dope activism don't tolerate this kind of language, right? Because of its harmful history. So be prepared for a lot of pushback, and be prepared for only certain, OG Chicanos to embrace you with open arms, right? Because a lot of that generation, a lot of this older wave of Chicanos, I mentioned them specifically because it's mostly them who use the term still. A lot of them are really hold on to things like La Raza and Aslan, which has its own problems, which I'll mention later in another video in time, and hold on a lot to the machismo that really plagued a lot of the Chicano movement, and that continues to plague it today as well. Don't think that contemporary movements are without its problems. So that's who your peers are going to be, because that's the only folks that are still very accepting of this term, right? And so do what you will with that information. Because I want to reiterate, this is La Raza is a term that has been used to ostracize and other and oppress folks who are not white, who are not mestizo, who are not Mexican, right? So I want you to think about who that term leaves out and who it welcomes and why, and if that's something you really want to associate yourself with. Oof. All right, so this was a long video. If you watched it till the end, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to drop a pink heart in the comments so I know you made it all the way to the end. Yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope you tune into the rest of the series. I will be continuing series unpacking how white supremacy has infected Latin America, right? So this is part 1, and I hope you join me for part 2, which will explore why there is a large population of white supremacist Latinxes, particularly Latinos. So yeah, tune in, watch my other content, and thank you for joining me. All right, take care. Bye. If you enjoyed this content and want to see more of it, feel free to support me on Patreon. Without Patreon support, I would not be able to put in the time, the labor, pay for the stuff that gets these videos made, right? So please support me on Patreon. If you don't have the financial means to do so, that's totally okay. You can absolutely support me by just sharing this video. Commenting goes a long way, liking the video, subscribing, sharing all these posts. That really helps the channel grow, which in turn help me continue to make this type of content. All right, thank you so much for watching again. Take care.